How did the colonization of America happen? 1492–1600. The year is 1492, and Christopher Columbus is catastrophically lost. He thinks he's in Asia. He's actually stumbled onto two continents that will reshape human civilization forever. But here's the twist that changes everything. Columbus will die still believing he found a route to the Indies. He never knew he'd encountered a new world. Yet his colossal geographical mistake triggered the largest migration, cultural collision, and transformation in human history. This isn't just a story about European exploration. It's about the moment when separate worlds, evolving independently for thousands of years, crashed into each other with consequences that still echo today. The world before contact. What was really at stake? Before we dive into ships and conquistadors, let's shatter a myth. The Americas in 1492 weren't empty wilderness waiting to be discovered. An estimated 50 to 100 million people lived across North and South America. The Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan housed over 200,000 people, making it larger than any European city at the time. The Inca Empire stretched 2,500 miles along South America's western coast, connected by 25,000 miles of roads. Complex trade networks, sophisticated agriculture, massive architectural achievements, these civilizations were thriving powerhouses. Meanwhile, Europe was emerging from medieval fragmentation into an age of ambitious nation-states. Spain and Portugal led the charge, desperately seeking direct trade routes to Asia to bypass Ottoman and Italian middlemen controlling the lucrative spice trade. Gold, silk, and spices weren't luxuries. They were the economic lifeblood of European power. Whoever controlled these trade routes controlled wealth itself. The accidental encounter, Columbus and the domino effect. When Columbus convinced Spain's Catholic monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella to fund his western voyage, he was selling a business proposition, a faster route to Asian riches. On October 12, 1492, he landed in the Bahamas, encountered the Taino people, and began one of history's most consequential misunderstandings. Columbus made 4 voyages between 1492 and 1504, exploring the Caribbean and parts of Central and South America. He enslaved indigenous peoples, extracted gold, and established the encomienda system, essentially forced labor disguised as Christian guardianship. But here's what's chilling. Columbus was just the opening act. His voyages proved that crossing the Atlantic was possible, and Europe's hungry empires took note. The floodgates opened. In 1494, Spain and Portugal signed the Treaty of Tordesillas, literally drawing a line through the unknown world and dividing it between themselves, without consulting a single person who actually lived there. Portugal got Brazil and routes to Africa and Asia. Spain got nearly everything else in the Americas. It was the most audacious real estate deal in history, carved from sheer arrogance and papal authority. The conquistadors, greed, steel, and invisible weapons. Enter the conquistadors, men like Hernán Cortés and Francisco Pizarro, whose names became synonymous with both astonishing conquest and breathtaking brutality. How did small groups of Spanish soldiers topple empires of millions? The answer isn't as simple as superior weapons. In 1519, Cortés landed in Mexico with roughly 600 men. By 1521, the mighty Aztec Empire lay in ruins. Cortés didn't achieve this through military genius alone. He exploited existing political fractures, forming alliances with indigenous groups who resented Aztec domination. The Tlaxcalans, bitter enemies of the Aztecs, provided thousands of warriors. Cortés positioned himself not as an invader, but as a liberator, until, of course, he wasn't. But the real killer wasn't swords or gunpowder. Smallpox, measles, typhus, and influenza ravaged indigenous populations with apocalyptic efficiency. Native Americans had no immunity to these old-world diseases. Some estimates suggest that up to 90% of indigenous peoples died from disease within the first century of contact. Entire civilizations collapsed not from warfare, but from invisible biological weapons no one understood. Pizarro repeated this template in South America. In 1532, with just 168 men, he captured the Inca Emperor Atahualpa, demanded a room filled with gold as ransom, accepted it, then executed him anyway. The Inca Empire, weakened by civil war and disease, fragmented. By 1572, Spanish control was complete. The extraction economy. Why they stayed conquest was one thing. Colonization, permanent settlement, and systematic exploitation was another. Spanish America quickly transformed into an extraction machine designed to enrich the Spanish crown. Silver and gold became obsessions. The discovery of massive silver deposits at Potosi, in modern Bolivia, in 1545, turned the mountain into perhaps the most important economic site in the world for the next century. Millions of indigenous people and later enslaved Africans were forced into mines under the mita system, compulsory labor that was essentially a death sentence. The silver flowing from Potosi financed Spain's European wars, fueled global trade, and paradoxically contributed to Spanish economic decline through inflation. It's one of history's great ironies. Spain conquered a continent for gold and silver, yet the influx of precious metals ultimately weakened its economy. The encomienda system evolved into the hacienda system, massive estates where indigenous peoples worked land they once owned. The Catholic Church arrived in force, building missions and converting millions, sometimes through persuasion, often through coercion. Cultural genocide accompanied physical conquest as indigenous religions, languages, and practices were systematically suppressed. The Northern Front. Different colonizers, different approaches. While Spain dominated Central and South America, other European powers eyed North America. But the colonization patterns differed dramatically, and timing mattered. France focused on the fur trade, establishing outposts in Canada and along the Mississippi River. French colonizers often married indigenous women and created Métis communities, blending cultures rather than replacing them entirely. Their colonial footprint was lighter, trading posts rather than massive settlements. England arrived late to the colonization game. Early attempts like Roanoke 1585-1590 mysteriously failed. The lost colony disappeared without explanation. But England's focus wasn't precious metals. It was land for settlement. This would prove even more devastating for indigenous peoples in the long run. The Dutch, Portuguese, and even Swedish briefly established footholds, each pursuing different economic models: trade, sugar plantations, fishing rights. The 16th century was a scramble, with European powers treating the Americas like a game board, where indigenous peoples were obstacles, not players. The Columbian Exchange. When worlds collided beyond conquest and colonization, something even more fundamental was happening: the Columbian Exchange. This wasn't just about people. It was about the complete biological integration of previously separate worlds. Europeans brought horses, cattle, pigs, wheat, and coffee to the Americas. They took back tomatoes, potatoes, corn, cacao, tobacco, and peppers. This sounds benign until you realize these exchanges transformed global agriculture, diets, and demographics. The potato would feed European population explosions. Corn would sustain African communities. But diseases traveled too, and the demographic collapse in the Americas was matched by no equivalent loss in Europe. Animals fundamentally changed indigenous life. Plains peoples who acquired horses became the mounted warriors of American mythology within generations. But they also brought European pigs, which multiplied wildly and disrupted ecosystems. The exchange was never equal, never fair, and never fully understood by those living through it. The legacy. Seeds of empires and resistance. By 1600, the Americas had been irrevocably transformed. Spanish America stretched from California to Argentina. Indigenous empires had collapsed, their populations devastated. African slavery was being imported to replace dying indigenous labor. European diseases, animals, plants, and people had fundamentally altered the hemisphere. But this wasn't a story of passive indigenous acceptance. Resistance never stopped. Rebellions erupted constantly. Indigenous peoples preserved traditions in secret, syncretized religions to hide old gods behind Christian saints, and maintained identities despite systematic erasure. Survival itself was resistance. The colonization of America wasn't inevitable. It resulted from specific choices, technologies, diseases, and moments of contingency. If Columbus had sailed a few hundred miles further south or north, if the Aztecs hadn't been in the midst of internal tensions, if smallpox hadn't ravaged populations, history could have unfolded differently. What happened between 1492 and 1600 wasn't just colonization. It was the violent integration of separate human worlds, the largest loss of life in human history, and the foundation of our modern globalized world, built on extraction, exploitation, and the collision of civilizations that changed everything forever. The question isn't just how colonization happened, it's how its echoes still shape our world today.